It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in Brookview Heights. The sun shone brightly, and the air was filled with the sound of children playing in the distance. Jamal and Maya were in the front yard, bouncing a basketball back and forth while Max, their dog, barked excitedly. Marcus sat on the porch, grading papers, while Jada prepared lemonade in the kitchen. Across the street, Eleanor Grayson stood at her window, her lips pressed into a thin line. She watched Maya laugh and Jamal dribble the ball with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. No respect for the neighborhood, she muttered to herself, picking up her phone. Her eyes darted to Marcus, who had now gotten up to join his kids in the game, his deep laugh echoing down the street. Eleanor dialed 911. "Hello, I need to report some suspicious activity," she said, her voice cold and deliberate. "There's a group of people loitering in my neighborhood. They're making a lot of noise, and I don't feel safe." "Yes, that's right, on Oakwood Drive, across from my house. Hurry, please." Back at the Johnsons' home, the family was oblivious to the storm brewing. They had just decided to head inside for lunch when 2 police cars pulled up in front of their house. The sound of the sirens pierced through the air, and Maya froze, clutching the basketball tightly. Marcus stepped forward instinctively, his heart sinking. He knew what this was. 2 officers stepped out of their vehicles, their expressions neutral but cautious. "Good afternoon, sir," one of them said, addressing Marcus. "We received a report about suspicious activity in the area. Can we speak with you for a moment?" Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "Of course, officer. What seems to be the problem?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with unease. The officer glanced down at his notepad. "The report mentioned loud noises and possible loitering," he said, looking past Marcus at Jamal and Maya, who were now standing silently by the porch. "Can we confirm who lives here?" Jada stepped out onto the porch, her hands trembling slightly. "We do," she said firmly. "This is our home. Those are our kids. Is there something illegal about playing in our own yard?" The second officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "Ma'am, we're just responding to a call," he said. "We're not here to accuse anyone of wrongdoing, but we do need to verify." Eleanor had now stepped out onto her porch, her arms crossed and her face smug. "It's about time," she muttered loud enough for Marcus to hear. He clenched his fists but didn't respond. The officers moved to ask the kids a few questions, their tone softening as they realized the call had been baseless. Jamal, standing protectively in front of Maya, answered each question politely, though his voice was tinged with fear. Marcus couldn't hold back any longer. "Officer," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "I'd like to know who made this call. My family has done nothing wrong, and this kind of harassment is unacceptable." The first officer hesitated. "I'm sorry, sir, but that information isn't something we can disclose right now." Jada stepped closer. "This isn't the first time we've dealt with this kind of thing," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "We just want to live in peace." The officers looked uncomfortable now. It was clear they knew the situation was unfair, but protocol dictated their actions. "We'll make a note in our report," one of them said. "You're not in any trouble. Please enjoy the rest of your day." As the police left, Eleanor smirked and turned to go back inside, but not before muttering, "Maybe now they'll learn to keep it down." Jada's chest heaved with anger as she turned to Marcus. "This has to stop," she said, her voice breaking. "We can't keep letting her get away with this." Marcus nodded, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We won't," he said. "Not this time." That evening, after putting the kids to bed, Marcus and Jada sat at the dining table, discussing their next steps. "We need to document everything," Jada said. "Every interaction, every false accusation. We can't let her weaponize the police against us." Marcus agreed. "We'll reach out to the neighborhood association, too. This isn't just about us. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Unbeknownst to them, one of their neighbors, Mrs. Harris, had witnessed the entire incident and was already taking action. She had recorded the scene on her phone and was preparing to share it online, determined to expose Eleanor's behavior for what it was. The Johnsons woke up the next morning to an uneasy calm. The memory of the previous day lingered like a storm cloud, but Jada and Marcus were determined to move forward. Over breakfast, Jamal asked the question that had been on his mind all night. "Mom, why did the police come?" "We weren't doing anything wrong," he said, his young face filled with confusion. Jada hesitated, searching for the right words. "Sometimes, Jamal, people judge others unfairly because of the way they look or where they come from," she said gently. "But that doesn't mean we let them define us." Jamal nodded slowly, though the weight of her words clearly affected him. Maya, sitting beside him, clutched her cereal bowl tightly. "Are they going to come back?" she asked, her voice small. Marcus reached over and placed a reassuring hand on hers. "We're not going to let that happen again, sweetheart," he said firmly. "Mom and I are taking care of it." Later that day, as Marcus stepped outside to mow the lawn, he noticed something unusual. Several neighbors, including Mrs. Harris, were gathered near the edge of his driveway. They waved him over, their expressions a mix of concern and determination. "Marcus, we saw everything yesterday," Mrs. Harris said. "It was wrong, and it needs to stop. I've already shared the video online. People need to know what's happening here." Marcus blinked in surprise. "You recorded it?" he asked, his voice laced with gratitude and disbelief. "I did," she said, pulling out her phone, "and it's gaining traction. People are outraged. I've had folks from outside the neighborhood messaging me, offering their support." As Mrs. Harris spoke, more neighbors began to join the conversation. A young couple, the Millers, expressed their disgust over Eleanor's behavior. "She's been a problem for years," Mrs. Miller said. "But this crossed the line." Encouraged by their support, Marcus shared the family's plan to document incidents and involve the neighborhood association. "We're not looking for revenge," he explained. "We just want to create a safe space for our family and others." The group nodded in agreement, offering to help in any way they could. Some volunteered to testify if needed, while others pledged to stand up to Eleanor directly. Meanwhile, inside the house, Jada was on the phone with a community organizer who specialized in addressing racial discrimination. The organizer, a woman named Tanya, provided advice on how to file an official complaint and escalate the matter if necessary. "You're not alone in this," Tanya said. "These situations are far too common, but change happens when people like you refuse to stay silent." Jada felt a surge of determination. "Thank you," she said. "We won't back down." But while the Johnsons were gathering support, Eleanor was doubling down on her efforts. Furious about the video circulating online, she called the police again, this time filing a noise complaint. She also began spreading rumors to other neighbors, accusing the Johnsons of stirring up trouble and ruining the neighborhood. The second police visit came late that evening. Once again, Marcus answered the door, calm but visibly frustrated. "Officers, this is the second time this week," he said. "We're being harassed, and we have proof." This time, the officers seemed less inclined to take Eleanor's complaints seriously. One of them, a younger officer named Ramirez, looked genuinely apologetic. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir," he said. "It's clear this is more of a personal issue than a real complaint." Jada stepped forward, holding her phone. "We've been documenting everything," she said. "This is targeted harassment, and we won't stand for it." Officer Ramirez nodded. "You're well within your rights to file a formal complaint. I can help direct you to the right department." As the officers left, Eleanor stood on her porch, glaring at the Johnsons. "This isn't over," she hissed, retreating into her house. Inside, Marcus and Jada sat down to strategize. "We need to escalate," Jada said. "Enough is enough." That night, Marcus reached out to the local news station, sharing their story in the video Mrs. Harris had recorded. Within hours, the footage went viral, sparking outrage across social media. Comments poured in, condemning Eleanor's actions and praising the Johnsons for their grace under pressure. The next morning, reporters arrived in the neighborhood, eager to interview the family. Marcus and Jada spoke candidly about their experiences, emphasizing the importance of standing up against injustice. "We're not looking for sympathy," Marcus said during one interview. "We just want accountability. This isn't just about us. It's about creating a community where everyone feels safe and respected." As the interviews aired, more neighbors came forward to express their support. Even those who had previously stayed silent began to speak out, emboldened by the Johnsons' courage. Eleanor, however, remained defiant, refusing to apologize or acknowledge her wrongdoing. The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point when the local police department announced they were launching an investigation into Eleanor's repeated false reports. "We take misuse of emergency services very seriously," a spokesperson said. "Our officers are here to protect and serve, not to be weaponized for personal vendettas." Eleanor Grayson was furious. The sight of news vans parked on her street and reporters speaking to neighbors felt like a personal attack. From her living room, she watched the interviews unfold on live TV, her face pale with anger. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, pacing back and forth. "They're making me look like a villain." But no amount of denial could stop the backlash. Online, the video of the police visit had spread like wildfire. Thousands of comments poured in, condemning her actions and praising the Johnson family's resilience. Even Eleanor's own acquaintances began distancing themselves, with some quietly unfriending her on social media and others outright calling her out. The pressure mounted when Eleanor received a call from the neighborhood association. "Eleanor, we've been hearing complaints about your behavior," the chairperson said sternly. "We need to discuss this in the next meeting. This kind of conduct reflects poorly on our entire community." For the first time, Eleanor felt the walls closing in. Her carefully curated image as a pillar of the neighborhood was crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. Meanwhile, the Johnson family story was gaining national attention. A prominent civil rights activist shared their story on social media, calling it a textbook example of how systemic bias plays out in everyday life. News outlets began requesting interviews with the family, and local organizations reached out to offer their support. Despite the overwhelming attention, Marcus and Jada remained grounded. They were determined to use the spotlight to spark meaningful change, not to seek revenge. One afternoon, as Marcus was heading to his car, he noticed Eleanor standing on her porch, staring at him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something shifted. Gone was the smugness that had defined her demeanor. Instead, she looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. "Mr. Johnson," she called hesitantly. Marcus paused, debating whether to engage. Finally, he walked over, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Yes, Mrs. Grayson," he said, his tone neutral. Eleanor hesitated, as if searching for the right words. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I just thought, I was trying to protect the neighborhood." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Protect it from what?" he asked. "From a family playing in their own yard? From kids laughing and being kids?" Eleanor flinched at his words, but didn't respond immediately. Marcus continued, his voice firm but not unkind. "Mrs. Grayson, I don't know what made you think we were a threat, but your actions didn't just disrupt our lives. They sent a message. A message that we don't belong here. And that's not something we can ignore." Eleanor looked down at her hands, guilt flickering across her face. "I didn't think of it that way," she admitted. Maybe I was wrong." "Maybe," Marcus said, his tone sharpening slightly. "Mrs. Grayson, you called the police on my family twice. You put my kids in a situation where they had to explain themselves to officers for simply existing. That's not something you can just brush off." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but Marcus didn't waver. "I appreciate that you're talking to me now, but words aren't enough. If you're serious about making things right, you need to show it." With that, Marcus turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor to grapple with his words. The turning point came a few days later during the neighborhood association meeting. The room was packed, with nearly every household represented. The Johnsons sat together near the front, surrounded by supportive neighbors. Eleanor, meanwhile, sat alone, her usual allies noticeably absent. The meeting began with a discussion of recent events. Marcus stood to speak, his voice steady and composed. "My family moved here because we believed in this community," he began. "We believed it could be a place where our kids could grow up feeling safe and supported. But recent events have shown us that there's still work to be done." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This isn't just about my family. It's about what kind of neighborhood we want to be. Do we want to be a place where people are judged and harassed for who they are? Or do we want to be better than that?" The room erupted into applause, and Marcus sat down, his message resonating deeply with the crowd. Eleanor hesitated for a long moment before finally standing. Her hands trembled as she clutched the microphone. I want to apologize, she began, her voice shaky. To the Johnson family and to everyone here. She took a deep breath, her face flushed with shame. I let my biases cloud my judgment. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, but I realize now that I was wrong. I was unfair, and I'm sorry. The room fell silent. Some nodded in approval, while others remained skeptical. But Marcus, ever the example of grace, stood and said, "It's a start, Mrs. Grayson. Now let's work on making sure it doesn't happen again." In the days following the neighborhood association meeting, a subtle but noticeable shift began to take place in Brookview Heights. Neighbors who had once exchanged little more than polite nods began to engage in meaningful conversations. The Johnsons, previously seen as outsiders by some, became the center of a community-wide effort to foster understanding and inclusivity. Eleanor Grayson, humbled and deeply shaken by the backlash, made good on her promise to show change through actions. She started by writing a formal letter of apology to the Johnsons, acknowledging the harm she had caused and pledging to educate herself on the biases that had driven her actions. She also volunteered to speak at a local community forum on racial bias, sharing her story as a cautionary tale. Though Jada and Marcus remained cautious, they accepted her apology, seeing it as a step toward healing. People can change if they're willing to do the work, Jada said, but it's up to them to prove it. Meanwhile, the Johnsons used their newfound platform to advocate for change beyond their neighborhood. They collaborated with the local police department to implement new policies for handling non-emergency calls, ensuring that officers would assess the credibility of complaints before escalating situations. They also partnered with community leaders to organize workshops on diversity, inclusion, and the importance of standing up against injustice. One such workshop was held at the local community center, where Marcus stood before a packed room, sharing his family's story. "This isn't just about one bad incident," he said. "It's about recognizing the systems and biases that allow these incidents to happen and working together to dismantle them." The event ended with a standing ovation, and many attendees approached the Johnsons afterward to express their gratitude and support. Among them was Mrs. Harris, the neighbor who had filmed the initial video that sparked the movement. "I just did what anyone should do," she said modestly. "You're the real heroes here." But for the Johnsons, the real heroes were the countless people who had rallied around them, proving that unity and compassion could overcome even the deepest divisions. Back in Brookview Heights, life slowly returned to normal, but it was a new kind of normal, one marked by greater awareness and a renewed sense of community. Jamal and Maya felt the change most profoundly. They played outside without fear, surrounded by neighbors who now greeted them warmly. Max, their dog, seemed to sense the shift too, wagging his tail enthusiastically whenever someone stopped to say hello. One sunny afternoon, as the family enjoyed a barbecue in their backyard, Marcus looked around at the laughter and joy that filled the air. "This is what it's all about," he said, raising his glass. "Building something better, together." Jada smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "We didn't just change our neighborhood," she said. "We showed our kids and everyone else that standing up for what's right makes a difference." The story of the Johnsons and their journey spread far and wide, inspiring others to take a stand in their own communities. The video that had once been a painful reminder of injustice became a symbol of resilience and hope, proving that even in the face of prejudice, change was possible. And as the sun set over Brookview Heights that evening, it wasn't just another day ending. It was the beginning of something new.